Hey, Heck, how's it going?
Hi, things are good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm just so excited that you're here today. And, I know you do a lot of great work. Um, I met Heck on LinkedIn, and this is really like our first like interaction together. So it really feels like we have just met up at a coffee shop right now.
It's one of those like very modern moments. I
Yeah,
appreciate
exactly. So Heck, I know that you are a managing director of impact strategy at a nonprofit called Tech Impact. So I guess um, I'm just curious, and I'm sure all our viewers are curious, like what does Tech Impact do? And also, what does it mean to be an impact strategist?
I appreciate the question. So let me start with Tech Impact. So we are, as you mentioned, a nonprofit organization. Our reach is not really regional. We have clients all over US mainland mainly, but our roots go back to workforce development. We actually have a lot of development around and still do workforce development programs to really introduce underserved and underrepresented individuals in the tech sector. So that's our mission really is in that vein and holds true to that. However, as part of that, we also have a client service wing to our organization other than our program side. And I'm part of the client service side and kind of engaging with partners. So under that, we offer services, managed services, cybersecurity, digital services, a data lab, and then my team, which is our impact strategy team. Completely honest, I think that we are this concept of an end-to-end experience. That's how I define the work that we do. We support with capacity building and technology, but also we're very much keen on education because of how we started our roots, right? So much of what we do is not really prioritizing our profit, but more so ensuring sustainability for nonprofits and the work that they do. When you think about people think cybersecurity or think about data or think about impact strategy, and it's like, oh, that sounds just like a term. But at the end of the day, these focusing on these different kind of like functions for an organization and the interconnectedness of it actually has implications for how you can operate and how do you sustain yourself. So that's our offerings. We engage with clients very much in a good faith basis of understanding your needs so that we can understand what to best recommend to you. And we're also very much collaborative understanding that we can't offer everything. A big key component for us is having partnerships and being able to just connect you where we might not be the service provider or the expert on that matter. In terms of your second question, you asked what is impact strategy or what is it to be an impact strategist? I feel like if you have an answer for that, you probably be close to like answering a very big tension in what I would call like years and years and years in the making. No, but not no, jokes aside, I don't feel like it's a tension. It's more so a really big question because it's a very big concept, right? And I think naturally to just answer that question, I'll explain a bit about my perspective and my view as to how we should define this, at least right now. So, for many years, it's been the concept of impact, and English is my second language, so I learned English technically. So I love a good synonym and a good adjective, and so it's really important for me to have to understand terms. And I think that that's gotten me in some good trouble over the years because it's been really important to learn that asking not just asking the right question, but being bold enough to ask those questions is
Mhm.
part of what actually impact is, right? And social impact from that concept. So taking away, you'll hear social impact, impact strategy, so many different perspectives. Like back in the day, like corporate, like CSR, ESG, like all those terms that were very familiar. I kind of call it to say that there are different versions and perspectives of what impact strategy and social impact is. We all know this, right? Like even down in like more of a clinical space, we've always known that public health and medicine are different things, even though they focus on the same concept, right? And so
Mhm.
that's a really simple way for me, or not easy, simple, for me to kind of like visualize what I mean. We've all been trying to do this and figure out what are we doing? what are we actually doing in society, right? It's not just we're delivering this programming, it's okay, and what? So not just the program's working, you're doing your reporting, you're meeting compliance. It's actually, and so how are you changing society? How are you changing people's lives? And, it gets complicated. It gets complicated when you ask that question because to a quantitative scientist, they're going to want to figure out a metric, a proxy, right? Like very much like a measure of success for some reason, but then to a person that's focused on cultural competence or doing this from an equitable evaluation standpoint, the question might be, how do we engage the people further to actually understand that? So there's no, I would say there's no like easy answer that I would give, but it's this very much collective approach, different skill sets, different sectors, tech, data, public health, social welfare, you name it, coming together to try and figure out what are we actually doing and figuring out what needs to change in our programs, in our operations, in our policies, in our advocacy. It's very much building strategy, right? And that, at the end of the day, it's in the name, but it's very much pulling the arrow before we launch it in archery. It's like pulling that momentum and holding it and figuring out when you're ready. It's collecting all that momentum. That's what I see the impact strategy perspective being.
Wow. Well, thanks for, sharing your knowledge about what that is. I just thought about, I was thinking about something that you mentioned that, when you were like learning English words, you're not just learning words, but it sounds like there's a context of like when you say certain things, how you say certain things. And it made me think about that cultural context that you're talking about, not just in terms of like, oh, this word is in Spanish or Italian or French, but in terms of just like culture of like a company or culture of a system. I think when people think about culture, they just think of, oh, maybe your ethnic background or your racial background or your linguistic background, but it's actually also just the norms, right? The social norms within an organization. Um, that just made me think of that, and I just want to make sure, like, uh, is what I'm thinking kind of related to the stuff that you're talking about?
I think so, and I think it's a really great point because, so more technically, I define impact strategy as the resolution between your operations and your programming. And so
Mm,
that already is understanding that there's a different directive to some of the work that happens within like a nonprofit. So I appreciate that because I think change management is just a core component to all of this work, right? It's like we saw management consulting be big in the private sector. It's not necessarily attainable for the nonprofit sector for years, but now it's all trickling down and like it's accessible. So it's a system, but it's also we're mission driven. Our goal
mhm.
is a mission. So it's a really interesting how do you take a model that fits another sector, quote unquote, and make it adapted in a sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's amazing that that your organization is able to provide this service for nonprofits because like what you said, like, they may not have the as much money as like a regular, you know, a large corporation to afford, I don't know, like something that they're mission driven, right? They're not like profit driven per se. So that's what I was trying to say. Um, but actually, this also made me think about like how did you get into this space? Did you just when you were a young person where you're like, you know what, I'm gonna do impact strategy one day? Like, how did you get here?
Totally. Yeah, no, but that was exactly it in my Encarta. I'm dating myself. It was listed under the I. No, it's a great question. I ask myself that a lot. And I think that curiosity is probably the answer. Um, I feel to build strategy, I always say strategy comes from the military and it just means pick one and follow it at the ultimate end of the day. But in order to do that, I found that curiosity and asking questions is what got me here for the most part. Training wise, though, I feel like there's also been a common thread. If you look at my kind of like my history and suppose education, experience, and all of that, unless I'm kind of explaining it to you and giving you a bit of a monologue, it doesn't make sense to most people. But I do pull, I do consider, I believe in T systems of learning. So I think the breadth and depth is important. I always think about like a hawk flying up to just be there and then it kind of diving deep when it needs to. And because of that, over the years, I've been threading just skill sets to kind of go to the tense of systems. So if I were to summarize all of my background, there's a lot of disciplinary variability, but it's probably systems and governance that it all highlights too. So it's what is it and how do we do it well? I remember in engineering school in college, I went to school for engineering first. But I remember in school just seeing a little box and being like in and out and learning that the difference was our job and understanding that difference and me being like, wow, this is so simple. And I think that that's now how I connect it to impact strategy, right? It's like, what was the difference? What was the in and out? But it's very simplistic because it was a unitary model, a simple model, but we always built upon it. And so going to school for engineering helped me kind of like not just learn how to ask questions because that could be come from different places, but I think just thinking about modules and boxes and well systems, and even though my discipline wasn't any type of industrial engineering or anything of the nature, I feel like training in that space gave me a perspective of just being able to take a step back and forget my discipline and look at a problem and look at a question and say, well, who might be missing here? What voice might be missing? What knowledge might be missing? So I have a lot of answers most of the time. I tell people, but it comes from the place of knowing that at some point there might be a person I need to turn to, and it comes from there, I feel. But that was engineering. I trained later on in my experience in college. I had been introduced to sort of like from a genetics perspective and more like biological, basic science perspective, just differences associated with race disparities and how that translated to drug development and how it was at the time, right? Again, dating myself. At the time, we were trying to figure out how medications were being, prescribed and how were we considering the different implications of biological differences that are associated with racial differences. And learning through some experience, just like how perhaps a lot of the work that I was doing was very forward thinking, but wasn't pausing on thinking about implications. And so taking a step back, I got very much motivated, landed in the world of environmental health and trained in under really exposure science, I would say, which is a collection of things, but it's exposure assessment, toxicology, you name it. But environmental and occupational health and really thinking about the system outside. So I had trained in the most smallest, microscopic concepts and then took a step really outside of that from the world of like the micro and thinking about the macro. And so I was able to kind of take this like end-to-end experience and I spent a lot of time trying to resolve those two spaces just in the middle. How do you meet? How do you meet? How do you understand how your environment's affecting you from a very minute perspective? Um, how should that affect our decisions? How should it affect our policies? Is later where it took me in life. It did not start there though. And so leaving sort of like academia, more like a bench science perspective was, I think, a really changing point for me because it landed me into pulling skill sets. Again, systems, but then also modular systems, not just one system. I was also thinking about government and public health, right? And then thinking about data. And so it started being this very much like trans system kind of perspective. And over the years, I feel like when you're doing innovation work, I always say that innovation is dangerous. It's new territory. There's no guidelines. There's no regulatory. We do have regulatory around the process and stuff so far, but right, like whatever happens, happens, and what you're learning. So that gets a lot of like challenges and like you have to answer a lot of questions. And I think that I just got good at that. And eventually, back in the day, I trained in school for more like statistics and math stuffy, but the world of artificial intelligence back in the day, machine learning, it's all rooted and interconnected. But back in the day, we weren't there yet with generative AI. But it was really important because a lot of the training that we received was really about implications and bias and right now in today's world, we are having a lot of freedom and opportunity, right? But Not saying we need to gatekeep because that's not the process that we need to do to scale innovation, but there's no guidance and regulation in some way. So kind of like landed me there, landed in the world of more like I would say data science. And I say that so loosely because I mentioned the data science and the machine learning part because there's divisions as to what it could mean. But doing work for nonprofits, and through that, we have clients all over. And so just note, it wasn't a specific nonprofit type. I wasn't working specifically with housing organizations or organizations that were doing um, public welfare work or anything of the nature. It was really supporting because data is so agnostic and technology is so agnostic. So landing here in my career, I kind of had the opportunity to really see the sector through my lens, which is technology, which I think it fits nicely with who I am because I have all this training from different kind of perspectives, right? And like math and not blah blah. But then it's like so agnostic that I can just sit at a situation. But then it's so integral also. And so I really like the job and I like the sector because it kind of speaks to who I am as a scientist, even though I don't necessarily practice science the same that I did before. But my job here kind of landed me there, and now I focus more. The impact strategy world is really taking a step back from the technical delivery and the implementation work, and after doing so much of it and talking to so many people, both strategically and more tactically, and thinking about ecosystems of stakeholders, I've kind of just found myself in this world of like question mark nonprofit sector work. And that's a long-winded answer to kind of explain a little bit, but hoping that it kind of inspires other people that and to understand that you don't land in the nonprofit world doing this type of work and impact, at least for me, an impact strategy from any degree necessarily. I love school, it works for my brain, but I find you need people that don't go to school also to make this work be really important. That's the whole concept of like building teams that are effective and co-designing and how do you actually potentiate your efforts. So groups are diverse, right? Not people. And so that's at the core of the work.
Wow. Thanks for sharing your, you know, colorful like journey. It sounds like.
I hope that's a good thing.
I mean, uh, I feel like some of your journey resonates with me, where you're kind of like bouncing from like different sectors or disciplines, right? And then being agnostic as well. Like I would say, like similarly, like I identify like I do like mixed methods, but I'm not married to one thing. I'm just like, let's see what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and then we'll work from there. Then we figure it out together. What makes sense for you, like what your capacity is, and like yeah, and basically, how do we implement something successfully instead of like having this nebulous big mission that like it's never gonna see the fruition of day. That's I think yeah. So I think I feel the same way as like what you're telling me. And like you mentioned this thing as like co-design in your ecosystem of stakeholders. I'm just throwing back the words that you said. I love that ecosystem of stakeholders. I guess like can you tell me a little bit more about your process and like working in this ecosystem of stakeholders with different backgrounds? You mentioned some of them may not have the same educational training as you have. I mean, you're very unique, right? But everyone also is very unique in their own way. But not everyone is gonna be like, 100% identical. So I guess how do you navigate this ecosystem of stakeholders?
I appreciate that question. And the comment I made earlier is probably like the core of it, which is to me, groups are diverse, not people, right? And that takes the question of who's a stakeholder to a question of what are we doing here again, right?
Mm,
And it's really thinking about checkpoints. It's really thinking about is the practice of what we're about to deliver on being, and this has no perspective on being like this is from an effectiveness standpoint, right? It's like, is the practice that we're about to deliver on going to be received well? answering that question, right? Is it going to be uptaken? The idea of uptaking comes back to my brain, right? Like it's perhaps a more technical term, but it's like, what is the uptake of our program? That simplistic, like mechanistic question is probably, I think that lands me so deep into it. So I don't know. I go back to it. And sorry, can you remind me of the question again, the highlight?
Oh yeah, no, I guess how do you navigate this room?
Yeah,
The,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
this,
Thank you, thank you. And so I was making that point because part of it is that being in that space and understanding that you can put a lot of investment. So if you really anchor, I think that parts of this is perspective, right? Like understanding that there's different perspectives. And that's something that I think that I've navigated a lot in my life personally, like identities and how to like navigate and be a chameleon and how do you get there. But you know, there's also a tension there about well, who needs to be the important voice and who gets to define what's important. And I think that for nonprofit organizations, there is a win opportunity because we do have a mission as organizations, and there's a lot of like implications financially to us to uphold that mission, right? So I think the buy-in is what I'm trying to speak to is much different in the nonprofit sector than it is outside of the nonprofit sector. But then, of course, you know, I'm not going to give you a boring, not boring, it could be interesting, historical nonprofit sector, kind of like history landscape. But for the most part, called sometimes the third sector, sometimes the independent sector, depending who you talk to, the nonprofit sector for all its faults and variability and it being a monolith. It really speaks to a sector that is a third sector, right? A sector that is not private, it's not government, it's in the middle and it's meant to deliver in that space. So just by nature, it has to exist in collaboration if it wants to sustain itself, right? And there is a difference, right? So when I think of nonprofits, I have a little ramp in my head always, and I say nonprofits that ramp up, nonprofits that sustain, and nonprofits that ramp down. And
mm,
that's about problems, right? Like it could be like there's a new policy and something has to be delivered, so a nonprofit gets established to help engage people, ramping up. Maintaining hospitals, easy, right? Like that'll always be around there. And then
yeah,
decreasing, it could be a nonprofit helping to reduce COVID outbreaks in 2021, right? It was very circumstantial and sectional, but because of that, it's just naturally a complicated system. It's not as simple as social good as most people think. It's not just social welfare, it's government, it's private partners, is relationship, it's actually that's even lobbying, right? Like there's a whole connection through all this work. And so just naturally, if you take a step back and again, remove your discipline, you kind of think about, oh, this conversation needs to be a stakeholder decision, right? It has to be an ecosystem. It has to be us thinking through who's here, who's not, and then what are we trying to do here to our mission, and do we need our community to be a part of this conversation? In what capacity? What can we really expect from them from a volunteer standpoint? How do we compensate them if that's the need? So it becomes these. It's a bridge of, to your point, of mixed methods, but it's kind of like a disciplinary mixed methods, right? It's like the
yeah.
social good part to the technical good part. It's like, how do you make this happen while also reminding folk that there's a bunch of folk that have been doing this work on community engagement for years, but the resources haven't necessarily been in surplus, right? To be able to innovate. And so in the space, in the spirit of innovation being dangerous, it's also wonderful because it allows for these types of conversations to take place and for us to be able to expand on that on the space of how do we make sure that people can be incorporated, right? How do we move our meetings so that it's accessible and that way we have the voices in the room. I think it's been interesting. It's implicated boards for sure, as a function and who gets to sit on them and what voices get to be contributive. But it's again to the balance of like operations and programs. That's who you are as a nonprofit, and really thinking about your implications, whether it's a policymaker or your community, you kind of have to balance and figure out. So it's rooted in that. The buy-in to that is great. The doing of it is the more complex part.
Wow. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. That actually made me think about, if I don't know if you've seen the first episode, Adriano was our first episode guest, and I actually took his class. That's how I met Adriano.
Oh,
Yeah, he teaches like at this business school, the Carrie Johns Hopkins Business School. But it was like an applied leadership capstone, And one of the activities we did was essentially the takeaway was like, who's the smartest person in the room? The room is the smartest
Mm.
in the room. And so when you were talking about, it's not just about like the diversity of each individual, it's actually the whole group. It's what the whole group as a group brings. That made me think about like Adriano and taking his class. Um, yeah, but like I appreciate your insight, and it's amazing that this is like also applicable in the spaces that you're occupying. And actually, I was wondering, okay, you're navigating tech and nonprofit, or tech and nonprofit, like in the mix of both worlds. I'm just curious about in the current times, like uh, what what challenges are nonprofits navigating in terms of like tech and I guess just uh, existing in the current times.
I appreciate that question. I probably would say that the challenges haven't changed as much for this sector, in my opinion. Not that they haven't changed in form, right? It's just, let me take a step back. The nonprofit sector, again, not giving a history lesson here, but the nonprofit sector itself has been so intertwined to government for so long that it's always not volatile, but it resulted in adaptability to whatever
Mm,
it's occurring, right? So I
yeah.
don't feel like that experience is new. And so because of it, there is a orchestration that I feel is kind of associated with the sector of like, how do we do this kind of mentality? And so from that standpoint, right, that's one thing. The other piece is that I really appreciate your question from a technology standpoint, because technology is not what it was 10 years ago. It's not what it was in the 1960s when the first social movements happened, right? So
Yeah.
not the first ones, but some of the ones that we can speak to. But so from this base now, the challenges probably stand in two places for me. It's not necessarily on specific solutions or, what do we need to cut out from the organization? Those conversations are happening. What do we need to add? Um, People are probably turning to cybersecurity questions about like, oh, okay, if there's going to be policies around your security of your data and making sure that you're, prepared to consume funding. It's kind of just been a lot of dialogue that's been occurring in this sector, and for many folk, it has been a lack of funding, to be frank, or opportunity to be able to do some of this work, but it's been prioritized. It's kind of this way of how do you prioritize operations in a world of programming? That's kind of like the question.
Mm,
Again, it happens very adaptable with every government. So I'll say that. I'll say that there's two buckets though, policies and funding. Again, nothing that I'm sharing is necessarily new. It's redefined and reimagined, but it's a big question about policies, and policies that imply like everything from like your web pages and down to like your operations, to your definitions, to what tools you're using. Excuse me.
you okay?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had to,
Uh,
I had to
it's
cough.
okay.
Um, so it's policies, right? And so that's one world. And that's really important because reimagining those policies, if you do it very tactically and reactive in a year, what's going to happen, right? We had to do it in certain events, and it's part of scenario planning and risk planning. But it's important to think about because any change in policy right now, especially with technologies like artificial intelligence and generative AI, it's changing so rapidly and continuously that you have a bunch of individuals making decisions about technology that are not necessarily familiar with the implications of the programming.
Mm,
And so again, it's this disconnect of programming and operations that I feel AI is really interesting, and any technology right now that's integrative, right? It's really interesting when you ask something to be integrated across your operations and your programs, right? Whether it's marketing and fundraising and like your administrative offices and then your programs. It's interesting because it starts asking these cultural questions, back to your point earlier, of how do we make this happen if we're operating in silos, or if we're operating effectively but that doesn't sustain scalability or change, right?
Mm. Yeah.
So I think that that's one space, and the other one is funding. And I think that this is not new, but the idea of nonprofit organizations, right? Take a step back from nonprofits. We know from an organizational science and organizational management and management science perspective that diversifying, even personal finance for that matter, diversifying your income streams and funding models is good. It generally results in benefits to you as an individual, as an organization, as a unit. And so for long times, many nonprofit organizations, because of the work that they do, have been very heavily dependent on grants, whether they're from government or private foundations mainly. And I say mainly just because it's important to note the relationship between public charities and private foundations as 501(c)(3)s. But, that world has existed, but as the nonprofit sector grows, so the problem grows, right? For those organizations that are maintaining or maybe like still ramping down problems in that little ramp period, like image that I shared earlier. They might be looking to innovate. They might be looking to get outside of their programming. They might be wanting to learn, to really think about like these concepts of adaptability, think about who are we missing. A lot of this learning can be seen as wasteful to some people, when not people, to some like funding models, right? Because there might be really committed to compliance, which is important too, right? You need to deliver on what you need to deliver. But if you can't pull more than 2% just to use a number for technology expenses, when you need 10% to move into a new technology data system, and that's the one thing that you really need to get your whole pipeline process understood and triage and your data secure, then what question do we answer first, right? Like it's
Mhm.
really it's an important one. So it's about funding and what are the restrictions around your funding, and if there is limits to how much you can spend on technology or on measurement and evaluation, but you're expected to report effectively. It's a question of like, wow. How do we navigate that, right? Like where do we what is reduced? Either our ability to do it or the ask this be made of us. And that's what, trust-based philanthropy, strategic philanthropy, the core of like let the people know what they're doing kind of model. That's really important. And it kind of like speaks to some of that. So again, to kind of say it's like this policy world because of all the implications, but then the world of funding and like where are you getting your funding from? Is it from private funders? Is it through collaboratives? Is it from government? What are the restrictions? And I'm not saying that this is everyone's goal, but it would be nice if in good faith and practice we get to a space of knowing that we can trust our nonprofits to do the work, but also equip them with a capacity needed to be able to deliver on it rigorously, right? And not necessarily have a view on the quality of the work if their capacity is not necessarily favorable in some ways.
Mm. That's so real. That's so real. And that also actually that made me think about each organization. I mean, this is gonna vary according to their own context, right? Like kind of like what you said in terms of like one funding mechanism that's good for one organization may not be a match for another organization because it depends on the different capacities at different levels for each organization. Um, but I'm glad there's folks like you and your and your org to help these nonprofits figure that out. Um, it's kind of like that made me think of like the grass is greener on the other side, but really like you should focus on your own grass.
Right, right.
uh, but yeah, we're really at the end of our chat here. Um, and I really appreciate this conversation with you. Um, I guess is there like anything that we didn't cover that you want to share with others in terms of like, I don't know, it could be anything. It could be um how to become an impact strategist or maybe just like how to work with you know this ecosystem of stakeholders? I know you already touched on those things, but if there's anything else that maybe some wisdom that you were not able to share yet that you want to tell people out there.
No, I appreciate that. And it's been really great speaking with you. So thank you for actually like making the space for these conversations. A lot of this work is really making people aware that it exists, right? Like it's this like from
Yeah.
one side to the other, it's like how do we bridge? And so that's the most important part that I probably like land with is find your bridges. Like find your bridges, find the common ground, find the bridges. I'm not pouring any moral opinion to what those bridges are, right? Like for some people, the bridge might be a financial implication. For some people, it might be like community, right? And that's more important to some folk. And I don't want to put any like priority to that. If we come to the conversation finding bridges, I think that that's where this work happens. It allows you to feel comfortable, to find your liaisons, to understand your proximity and lack thereof. To welcome also new voices as a BIPOC, a person of, as a queer BIPOC person in leadership, in a lot of spaces over the many years, it's been really important to also navigate. This is new for a lot of folk, for me, and it is for them. And that's been really important to kind of find bridges that way. And I would say kind of end with it's an information sharing. There's a lot of folk doing masked under qualitative work, mixed methods, participatory actionable research, right? Under all these terminologies. There's people that are really figured out much of this work, and it's just that it's been so intellectualized by some and perhaps communicated as intellectual by others that just find those folks, find those voices, build bridges. And I would probably say, and this is my own bias, researchers, and we're both researchers, so this is probably like an omen to what I'm about to say. Researchers are a really great bridge, between theory and practice. If you find the appropriate person that has that experience of having been in a theory and a practical space, they're a great asset, and they happen to have the language and the connections between those two buckets of like the practice and the theory and the what's here, what's there, the discipline, the cross discipline. Um, and I feel like that's just my 2 cents. It's find your bridges, and in my opinion, researchers are a great asset. Um, you just gotta want to listen. And I know it's a different language sometimes, but I think that's really important. It's been a learning I've kind of gotten, and it's been helpful to help translate. I've been really privileged to be able to sit in that space of being able to help translate between what the research is doing and what people are doing in practice.
Yeah, well, we need more bridges like you.
No,
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, because like a lot of not, I mean, not trying to generalize, but some researchers, they don't necessarily know how to become bridges, um, in terms of like translating, which is, I feel like that's a um, key factor, translating between like that academic language and to like communicate that in a way that is digestible to someone who may not have like a similar background as
Mhm.
researchers like us, basically. So I really appreciate your uh, nuggets there of wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you. Which is, as long as you agree, I am okay. That is
Yeah,
all that.
no, I agree. I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's been
actually, when
really
you were talking about bridges, it made me think like, oh, that's you're such an engineer. Like,
there you. I
bridges.
told you it was gonna be. I told you it was gonna pop up in random space.
Right, right. Well, thank you again, and I really appreciate you, and I hope really people think about this more, because these are things that like you think organizations just function and randomly, but no, like there is such a thing as a strategy here, and like people should be not just nonprofits, but everyone should think about strategy, like in any
Yeah.
capacity.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you, and I hope you have a great year.
Likewise, and I'm really excited we connected to excited to this colleagueship to grow. Thank you for talking, and look forward to talking soon. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.